Okay. So, I'm honored again to present our keynote speaker, Gert Biesta, who has the task of closing this conference. I believe that we will be able to do this better than anyone else because of his lucid vision of education and its function in our world today. Gert Biesta is Professor of Public Education in the Center for Public Education and Pedagogy in Maynooth University in Ireland, and Professor of Educational Theory and Pedagogy in Moray House School of Education at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. Professor Biesta is interested in relationships between education and democracy and the public role of education. His work focuses on education in formal and non-formal settings with a strong interest in teachers, teaching and teacher education, curriculum, educational relationships, and the emancipatory potential of education. Recent books include The Rediscovery of Teaching, 2017, Educational Research and Unorthodox Introduction, 2020, and World-Centered Education, A View for Present, 2021. Since September 2020, he is member of the Scientific Curriculum Committee in the Netherlands. I and other colleagues of mine approach Gert's work thanks to a book with a very evocative title, The Beautiful Risk of Education, written in 2014, a provocative volume that focused on the need for education and the recovery of the central role of teaching. Today, we took the title for a more recent volume, 2021 volumes, World-Centered Education, A View for the Present. We are very grateful to Professor Biesta because he reminds us of the function of education and schooling and the close contact of epistemologically defined knowledge with the reality in which we live. I'd like to thank Professor Biesta for accepting our invitation, and I welcome him to the floor. Thank you, Gert.
Okay, thanks very much. Hello, everyone. I only arrived last night, so that feels a bit odd, but this morning was already lovely and very interesting. It's great to be here and an honor to have this task to finish you off, as they say. So I'll do my best with sharing some reflections on education, and I'll tell a story, and hopefully there isn't too much semiotic overload on the PowerPoint there, and we'll see where we end up. I claim that I know a lot about many things, but not about textbooks. So that's also an interesting position to be in, and I will make some connections, and I hope you can make further connections. I do speak to the theme of the conference, and particularly this question of an uncertain future. Because the future is always uncertain, but at some points in time, it feels much more uncertain. And I feel strongly that we are in such a point of time. And then the question is, what do we do as educators? So I'd like to speak to that, taking up a rather big question, maybe a bit presumptions, but what is it that really should matter in education? And when I look around and hear answers to that question, I hear things like this. Education should focus on the production of measurable learning outcomes, PISA. It should use evidence-based interventions, ideally based on what we know about the brain, in order to move countries up in league tables. and create a culture of competition and control. And you probably recognize some of that, and I'm sure you have your own opinions about that. Now the question is that a desirable future? Or is it a road to nowhere, if you still remember the title from the Talking Heads album? This is a generational test. I'm not too excited when I hear what I just showed you, this global consensus. And I think it's important to stay awake and keep thinking differently. Margaret Thatcher became known for a phrase where she said, "There is no alternative." And I think as soon as we say there is no alternative, we have given up on the future. So at least our intellectual task is always to ask, is there an alternative? Because then we can keep considering and come to judgment about whether we go left or right, you could say. I am inspired by many people, but I keep returning to the work of Hannah Arendt, who has beautiful phrases. And one I really like is a challenge she puts to all of us, the challenge to try to be at home in the world. And that's already a contradictory challenge, because you can say to go into the world, we need to leave the security of our home. So to be able to be at home in the very place that is not our home poses a very real and profound challenge. And in the little book I recently published, I think I ponder on that challenge in relation to education, making a case for education that is neither curriculum-centered or knowledge-centered, but also not student-centered or learner-centered, but world-centered. You can say that's a play with words, but I think there is slightly more there. But again, that's for you to judge. So I want to show you a couple of steps in order to at least point at the way in which I try to think about those issues. And I start with a very simple but also really important question, because here we are as educators and our people watching from other places in the world. Educators with a lot of skill, knowledge, experience, good intentions, but does our work make any difference? So quite a key question. One author who asked this question and asks it in a really interesting way and then comes up with a fascinating answer is Dietrich Benner, Professor Emeritus of Education at Humboldt University in Berlin, who asks the question about the difference that our work makes by raising the question, what is the contribution of education? Because we do know that education is not everything. So he raises an interesting question in his book on the general theory of education, where he says we know that human beings are natural organisms, developing beings. So there is a nature component in how we become. We also know that environments are tremendously influential. So there is a nurture component. And then you can say, and then there is us educators who also like to make a contribution. So what's that contribution? And we can play with that. We can say, well, if the universe is just, then we should each have an equal share. But we know that the universe doesn't care about that. So when you look at discussions over time, you see moments in time where people say it's really the environment that's a major factor. what I think I see over the past decades is that the argument for the nature component is strongly pushed with educational genetics, for example. So what would be the percentages we can put there? You can think about your own answer. Before I share Benner's answer to this question, I want to show you 3 vignettes because they give some depth and maybe some concreteness to what I try to say here. The first is this person, who you may recognize. It's Rosa Parks, who boarded a bus in Montgomery, Alabama in, I think, 1953. And the bus had these signs: wide forward, colored rear. And the story you may know is then when Rosa Parks was asked to move to the back part of the bus, she refused. If we just live in the world of PISA and literacy, we can say, oh, this is a case of educational failure because there is a very clear message and there is a person who is unable to decode this message. So we should say as educators, this is a bad example. Here is another person who a couple of decades earlier looked like this, Adolf Eichmann, who was responsible for the logistics of the concentration camps. He fled to South America after the Second World War and was captured by the Israeli Secret Service in the early 60s, brought to Jerusalem and put on trial. And his case is interesting, and of course I'm taking iconic examples here, because when he was asked whether he was responsible for what happened, he said, no, because I was following the orders of the people above me. If you frame that in the context of citizenship education, you can say, wow, educational success, a citizen who really listens well and obeys to all the values of society. So the vignettes show that there is something wrong. In my book, I talk about this, and I'll come back to these 2 cases in a minute, and I construct the idea of the Parks-Eichmann paradox, that what looks like educational success from one angle actually becomes educational failure when you look at it from another angle. But I was also struck by this. Zelensky, who a couple of weeks ago was talking about the offer he got to be transported safely out of Ukraine. And he made the interesting point where he said, if I would have left Ukraine at that point, I would be alive, but I would no longer be a person. And I find that a fantastic distinction he makes there. That to be a person is very different from being interested in your own survival. And the other person I think we shouldn't forget, Joshua Wong. I checked last night, he's only 26. He's 2 years younger than my youngest daughter and has already been in jail for 27 months in Hong Kong, simply because he makes the case for democracy. So back to Benner then, and his answer to the question of the percentages, nature, nurture, and education. And the point he makes in his book is this. We can disagree about the exact percentage, but nature and nurture together are always 100%. And the first time I read that, I thought, oh, it's late, I need to read again tomorrow morning. Second time I thought, probably my German is not that good. And slowly I began to see what he is trying to say there. And the point, to put it briefly, is that Benner is saying, yes, nature and nurture together make us who we are. But as educators, we are interested, we should be interested in a different question. not, you can say, who we are, how we become, what languages we are able to speak, how knowledgeable we can talk about all kinds of subjects, but what each of us does with that. So one way to put it is to say education is concerned with the question how an I can step forward out of that mix of nature and nurture that is somewhat different for all of us. And with that, Benner is doing all kinds of things, which I would summarize by saying the educational question is actually of a different order. It's not the question of nature and nurture. You can say that's the job for the psychologist, the sociologist, the biologist, the neuroscientist. But as educators, we stand in a different intellectual discipline, a different practice with a different question. And that is precisely not this question, how all these factors determine how we become who we are. Not to say that that is not relevant. And as educators, we also are in that range, you can say. So a curriculum, in a sense, is also an environmental influence. But the educational question has a different focus. Benner uses an interesting phrase from German philosophy, from Fichte, where he says, what is education? That's Aufforderung zur Selbsttätigkeit, summoning to self-action, if you try to translate it sort of quite closely. And that summoning is precisely not to say to students, be yourself. And I think I hear an awful lot of that in schools. But it's to say to students, be a self. And in that subtle difference, maybe you can find the difference that Zelensky was also referring to, the difference between living and being a person. I'm always impressed by German educational scholarship because they manage to use so many words and pages for that. But I always also try to find what's the shortest way to summarize it. And I think I would say one way to summarize it is to say what we do as educators when we are pursuing the educational question is that we knock on the door of our students in all kinds of ways. We can do that. And we ask this simple question, is anyone there? And then you can suddenly see how the stories from Eichmann and Parks shift, because when Eichmann encountered that knock, he said, I'm not here. Here is just a thing that obeys the rules and the orders. And when Rosa Parks encountered that knock, she said, I'm here and I'm not going to move. Just interestingly, as Zelensky is saying, I'm not going to move. And Joshua Wong was saying, I'm not going to move. I will keep standing for democracy, whatever the consequences. So the point I'm trying to make in all these ways is to say, actually, the educational question is a very special question, a very precious and a very important question. And I would characterize it as an existential question. Not in terms of sort of French philosophy and Sartre and smoking Gauloises and drinking strong coffee, but in the way of saying this is not a question who we are, how we become who we are. The educational question is the question how we are, how we try to exist. And that's always a trying, because that's ongoing. And in that way, I think the educational question is special, and it's a very different question from psychological questions, sociological questions, also I think learning theory does not immediately speak to that existential question. Why not? Because you can say the question how we are is always about how I relate to how I have become, how I relate to my identity, what I do with what I have learned, with all the capacities and all the competencies. But it's also interesting that we never reach perfection there. And nonetheless, the question, what will I do, poses itself whether we want it or not. So it's also the question what I will do with my inabilities, my blind spots, my incompetencies, this interesting mess or mix of who I am today. And then you can say what I will do when it matters. And the question when it matters is most of the time not under our control. These are the things that cross our life path, where we can respond or can walk away from it. I think it's important that in education we, how shall I put it, have our own concepts, or at least have concepts that make a difference. In my own work, I come back to this notion of subjectness, which in some languages works better than in others. You can say that the ongoing challenge we encounter to exist as a subject of our own life and not as an object of what other people want from us. So you can say that the educational question is the question of the I, and this probably fits just on a t-shirt, but I'm not sure whether it looks right. But not the I who is interested in itself, but the I who tries to always exist in the world and with the world. So this is just, you can say, a proposal, an alternative to say, what if this is actually the most important, most central, most fundamental educational question? And yeah, we can talk about it, and you should have your own thoughts about it. But if this suggestion makes sense, then we can go back and look at, what shall we call them, really existing schools, really existing colleges, really existing universities, really existing virtual educational environments. And we can ask, is that question alive? And I'm not sure. I think that there is an ongoing risk that this question is being squeezed out and replaced by all kind of other questions. Think of this list that I started with. I see too many countries who say, what's the main ambition? We should end up higher in the PISA rankings. Actually, I find that a scandal, but I can quote from ministers of education who say, this is the first priority for all the work teachers do in our country. And I find that at least sad, but maybe also worrying. This has something to do with particular pressures on education, and that observation is not new, but I think what you can see over the past 20 years is that there is a pressure on education to narrow what education is about, to measure that and put it in competitive frameworks. So you see that with what I would call here extreme curriculum-centered conceptions of education that say we need to focus on producing a small set of learning outcomes. It's often about academic achievement, but increasingly you also find notions of the responsible citizen or the good citizen or the collaborative citizen. And the whole measurement industry that contributes to that push. What's good about this is it doesn't come out of bad intentions. When you start to dig, you find concerns for equal opportunities, for social justice. And those concerns are real and they are valuable. But I think the way in which it is addressed is unhelpful. Because you can say rather than that it keeps the student as subject into view, it constantly runs the risk of pushing the subjectness of the student out and just become interested in learning outcomes. So it becomes a problem, I think, when students disappear from that picture and just reappear as objects that produce learning outcomes that can be measured. So the minister who says the task of all the teachers is to make sure that, in this case, Australia ends up in the top 5 of globally performing education countries, there are no students in that statement. I'm also worried when students are themselves sort of pushed to become part of this game. For example, when they are told that they need to regulate themselves, take ownership of their learning. And that all sounds nice, but when a student says, yes, I take ownership today, I quit school, and I'm going to do something else, suddenly then all the control comes back again. So you can say students are there also sort of forced to make themselves into an object that needs to be managed. So there are worrying developments there. And then you can say, but there is also a counterforce. There are people who say, yes, there is far too little space for students to express themselves. Let's broaden the curriculum. Let's give a place for student voice, for their own sense-making, for creativity, meaning-making, articulating their own identity. I see this, for example, in arguments for bringing the arts into the curriculum, in making a case for child or student-centered education. There are alternative modes of education that contribute here. And you can say an expressivist way of thinking about education could be a counterforce. But I'm not sort of easy to please because I still see a problem there. And the problem can be highlighted with the simple question, what if? So we can say it's wonderful if there is scope for student voice, creativity, identity, but what if that voice is racist? What if the creativity is destructive? And to destroy, well, you need to be creative. What if the identity that wants to articulate itself is only interested in itself? And there, for me, again, I think that the educational question becomes visible, where you say, yes, it's important that education allows for students to arrive in the world, but that cannot be the final point. The work we need to do is to raise questions about whether what arrives, whether who arrives, whether what arrives in the life of the growing child will help or hinder them in their attempts to exist as subject. And this sounds quite theoretical. You can think of these schools that say, if you send your child to our school, we will make sure that all their talents will be developed. And I immediately then want to say, well, wait a minute, I have some talents that I really do not want to develop. For me, the real question is which of these talents, which of this potential I have is going to help and what is going to hinder. Because to be a criminal is also a talent, you could say. So always we need to ask that question of the distinction. We as educators have work to do there, but we cannot keep running behind all our students for the rest of their lives. So the most beautiful thing that can happen if when our students say, I want to carry that question in my life. Not the answer, but the question, carrying the question of everything we encounter. Is this going to help or is this going to hinder? And there you can say, we are doing this work of helping our students, encouraging our students to be a self and not just to be themselves and be satisfied just with who they are. In my own work, I've looked for language also to say, what we're doing there is trying to arouse a desire in our students for wanting to be in the world, not at home, but to be there in a grown-up way. And this has something to do with putting the center of education in the world through this challenge of trying to be at home in the world. I forgot to look at my watch when I started, so I'm not sure how much time there still is, but I'm sure someone will start wave with arms if it... So what I'd like to do are two more things, say a few things about what this means, existing in the world in a grown-up way, and then to ask what kind of educational qualities might be important there. And then I'll come towards some conclusions. So to exist in the world is to meet the world in its reality. And you can say that the first experience of meeting the world is when we encounter resistance. When we want something and the world says, wait a minute, that may not be possible. That experience of resistance is, I think, already tremendously important in our life because it shows that the world is not a construction, not a fantasy, but that the world is real. What can we do when we encounter resistance? And you can think of maybe you and a group of friends where you say, oh, I have a really good idea. And then your friends look at you and say, we don't think so. What do you do in that situation? Or in working with clay, for example, where you say, oh, I have a brilliant idea what I want to make out of the clay, and you begin. And the clay doesn't allow you to do that. It keeps falling apart or going down again. The encounter with resistance in that sense is frustrating because it stops your own initiative. And one thing you can do out of that frustration is to say, yeah, but I still want this to happen, so I'll put more energy in it. That's sometimes really important. Think of Joshua Wong, who said, I really think that we need to keep making the case for democracy, so I will keep pushing harder. But that push always has a danger, that you push so hard that you destroy the very world in which you want to arrive. So you can say there is always the danger when we step into the world that we destroy the very place in which we arrive. The same frustration can also work in the opposite way. When you meet this world in all its complexity and say, gosh, this is far too difficult for me. And you begin to step back. And again, sometimes that's really important when you say, yeah, I have all kind of ideas and desires, but I need to step back so that other things can happen. But if you step back too much, at some point you step out of the world. And there you can say there is always the risk of what you can call self-destruction. Those are places where we are not in the world, when we destroy the world or leave the world. And there you can begin to see that the real challenge of existing in the world is to try to stay somewhere in this curious middle ground where we neither destroy nor walk away. We can call that dialogue as a way of being with. And again, that is a lifelong challenge. to find that middle ground, not too much and not too little. That you can say is the ongoing challenge of trying to be at home in the world. And you can say that that space is not just the world, but it's also a very educational space. Because when you manage to stay in that space, you are being taught something. You encounter something to begin with, that you are not alone in the world and that the world is real. So I'm still looking for this school who has the courage to put on their building, this is a place where we try to hold you in between world destruction and self-destruction. For me, that would be an educational way to talk about the school, rather than to say, if you come here, all your talents will flourish. I think the risk is that that is a lie. So to exist in the world in that particular way refers to a particular quality of trying to be there. And again, in English, I use this phrase, to be there in a grown-up way. And it's funny when you look at different languages that try to characterize that quality, many of the words are grow words. In Dutch, there is volwassenheid, and I think in German there is something very close as well. That would be too easy, where we say, okay, we grow up, and at some point, suddenly we are grown up for the rest of our lives. That's not how life works. This challenge of staying in the middle ground is there all the time and poses itself again and again. Therefore, you can say the challenge is an existential question. Philippe Marieux, a brilliant French educational scholar, says the challenge is to be in the world without putting yourself in the center of the world. That means that you constantly have to engage with this question. Is what I desire, what announces itself in me as a desire, is that what I should be desiring? Is it desirable for my own life, for my life with others, for my life on a planet that has limited capacity to meet all our desires? And that, you can say, is an interruptive question. And I'll come back in my final point about the importance of interruption in education. This is not an argument for getting rid of our desires, because our desires sustain us. The real challenge is to figure out which desires are going to help and which are going to hinder, which desires we should try to amplify and which desires we should try to contain. For me, this suggests that if we want to do any of this work in educational settings, there are three qualities that are important. One is the interruptive quality, that education in some way helps to interrupt the desires that students put on the table, that they interrupt tendencies of just being interested in yourself, that they interrupt identities where people are too certain about their identity or their desired identity. I even think, and that's a wonderful and big discussion, that education should interrupt the natural and social order there. Not in order to destroy, but in order to make an encounter possible with what is real. And I think that raises not just interesting questions for curriculum, but if we had another couple of days, I would be curious to see what would this mean for a textbook or for educational media, because these are media that are representations. So can you encounter something that is real there? So education needs to have an interruptive quality. It needs to take resistance as something positive and not just as something that we need to overcome. That's why I'm not a fan of sort of personalized learning trajectories. education also needs its own time, because if you meet something that is real and meet yourself in relation to that, we should give students fair opportunities to go into that and stay with it. So the principle of suspension, of slowing down, is also really important. And again, I'm curious about what would that mean for educational media. Can they help in slowing things down? And there are good educational thinkers who exactly understand the slowness that education needs, so that there is time for students to meet themselves. And if education is this difficult middle ground, and if we feel as educators that there is important work to do there, we also should provide our students with sustenance, with support and nourishment to stay with that. And again, you can ask, what does it mean for a textbook to provide sustenance to students to stay with that difficulty? Interruption, suspension, sustenance, I think, point in a very different direction from what I hear a lot in education. This idea that the faster students go through a curriculum, the better student they are. I think the risk is that if you go too fast, you will not encounter anything. You will just rush to the finish. So if you sort of see how the story hangs together, then the final question is there still time for these qualities in our educational institutions and endeavors? And is there still an appetite for this? You can even say, is there still time for the time of the school? Because what's interesting about the word school is that in Greek it first of all means free time. And free time doesn't mean leisure time, but time that doesn't come already with a productive agenda. And there you can say the school should be this wonderful place where we actually give time to the new generation to meet the world and meet themselves in relation to the world. And there I think the argument for the school is a really important one in a world that wants to get rid of the school and just move it all into online lifelong learning. So the question of the school as an educational institution, and again the media that support that, is a really critical one at this point in time. Is the educational question still possible in how we do schooling in universities or not? We talk a lot about the emancipation of our students, but maybe what we first of all need is an emancipation of the school, so that it's not just there to do all the things that society wants from the school, but that the school can still be school. So rather than to say, what kind of school does society need, there is a more urgent question, what kind of society does the school need so that it can be school? Is society still willing to take the educational question seriously? And then a little coda, and that brings me back to Arendt. It's the question of understanding. Is education a question of understanding? And many people would say yes, because ultimately we want our students to understand the world, themselves, the curriculum. So we want them to work with questions like, what does this mean? How can I make sense of it? And as teachers, we do a lot. And again, when you look at textbooks in a particular way, you can say, these are avenues towards understanding. But then, Hannah Arendt comes with a definition of understanding where she says, what is understanding? Understanding is an unending, lifelong activity by which, in constant change and variation, we come to terms with and reconcile ourselves to reality, that is, try to be at home in the world. And I find this profound, I think, that she takes this word understanding and makes it into an existential question, and therefore puts it at the heart of education. If you begin to think about understanding in that way, then a different question becomes foregrounded. Not a question, how can I make sense of the world? How can I learn about the world? Legitimate questions. But another set of questions. What is the world asking of me? Right here, right now, today. What is the world trying to say to me? What is the world trying to teach me? And for me, that is sort of the turn or the return of the educational question, which suggests that the world ultimately should be in the center of education, because that's where our lives take place. And the world will always surprise us, and we can never know how the world will surprise us. And it will remain a challenge whether at that point we say, okay, I'll move to the back of the bus and will be obedient, or where you say, from now on, I'll say no to that, because I believe that this is no longer how our world should be. So, stop making sense, not too much understanding, and don't forget that life is the most precious and most important thing that we have, and we need to do our best in doing that well in education and beyond that. So thanks for your attention, and I think the work you do around textbooks and media is really underrepresented in some of the education journals I'm involved in, so this is also an encouragement to push that work more into the mainstream. Thank you. There are 2 minutes left, so that's enough.
Thanks for a wonderful presentation. I was wondering, what does this entail for the more concrete content of education? And that is, maybe that's also a critical comment or question. You seem to point to a very, the moral, existential, but also maybe individualistic dimension of becoming a person. And the case of Rosa Parks, she was actually born out of a long history of organizing, collective organizing. She was part of a movement. She wasn't just a moral subject that suddenly stepped up onto the world stage. So, that would mean that education also entails knowledge and theories about how the world works, how the world should be changed, what powers are at work in the world, and so on. And that's a bit more, maybe more controversial issue. So how should we tackle that? Because there are different views on what should actually be learned about these things.
Yeah. It's a good point, and of course I've pushed it a bit in one direction, and that helps maybe also to rebalance. Although I do think there is something individualistic that matters. So yes, we can support each other, and that is very important as well, and you can see that out of these historical examples. So Rosa Parks came out of a history. Eichmann as well, of course. He was also part of a community that pushed in a particular way. And I think what these examples show is that there is still a question for each of us that others cannot resolve for us. So in that point, the individualism is important, but that doesn't mean that we cannot support, encourage each other. So that's one thing. The other thing is that this is not a case to say, let's just do good social interaction and whatever and forget about knowledge and understanding. On the contrary, this question of how we meet the world, encounter the world, that's the question of curriculum. But not curriculum just as knowledge that needs to be sort of remembered and reproduced. So I tend to think curriculum itself, the content of education, that is the way in which in schools, in colleges, we put the world on the table. But not, I would say, from the question, so what should students learn here? But maybe more beginning with this question, so what is, when I encounter this body of knowledge, what is it asking of me? So I think even that question also has didactical potential. And there you can say curriculum content matters, but it also needs to work with a slightly different question. But we can never encounter the world in the abstract. So we have to meet the world in the concrete, but also in concrete representations. So it's not pushing all that out, but maybe in my own teaching, this question, what is this asking of me, is becoming more and more a very productive question to do work in classrooms that at one level looks very traditional and straightforward, but with a different question, all the things gain different meaning. So that's at least to say this is not an argument against curriculum or content or understanding, but it puts the center and the ultimate weight of what we do somewhere else.
Thank you, Gert. I really enjoyed that. And my comment is really following on from the previous one, which is you put the one of the quotations from Hannah Arendt relating to the term understanding as a constantly evolving process. So in my conversation sometimes with policymakers in government offices in different countries, we may have a sort of discussion about how are you using the word learning in this sense, because very often it becomes a short form for an outcome, a specific thing. You've learned this, you know, as opposed to that idea of learning as a way of being and a way of doing. So these are two things which have to be held, and I can have that conversation with policymakers. And that term understanding, I can see it operating in the same sort of way, that there are points at which you arrive at something, and that has to be part of the planning process for framework, for teachers' planning, and for evaluation, assessment, student assessment. But it's also a constantly developing process. You've never actually arrived. You arrive, but you haven't arrived at the same time. Mm-hmm. So I can see a way of squeezing that sort of philosophical thinking into a practical discussion with a policymaker, from my perspective.
Yeah. So there, I think, as educators and educational scholars, we need to be clever. We need to find ways to make the point very quickly in conversations that use a very different language or come with very different interests. And I think there are ways of doing that. So the one that really works well is if people say, yeah, the task of educators is to promote and support child's development, and then I can just say, yeah, criminals also need to develop, so that cannot be the point. It's always to look for ways to show where actually the critical difference lies. And I think many policymakers just suffer from being exposed to bad ideas and simple solutions and promises. And there you can say there is an educational task, because we also don't want our students just to have superficial ideas. We want them to be exposed to the things that really go to the heart of the matter. So that's also educational work to do with policymakers, because often they just get the world according to PISA, and that's not a real world and not a world in which things matter. PISA doesn't speak to what's happening in the Ukraine. That's the big problem with PISA. I think that's enough for today, but thanks very much.